Do you remember the moment you started to wonder? Maybe it was watching someone you've known for years say something you've heard them say 1,000 times before, and you suddenly became aware that you were watching them say it. Maybe it was in the middle of doing something you used to love, a hobby, a ritual, a way of being, and you felt yourself standing outside of it, observing yourself doing it, like you were watching your own life through a surveillance camera. Maybe it happened while listening to someone talk about their passion, their dreams, their reasons for being alive, and you heard yourself think, "I don't know how to feel that anymore." You didn't lose it suddenly. It was more like you woke up in the middle of a game you didn't remember joining, and once you realized it was a game, you couldn't unsee that it was a game. The other players were still playing, still believing in the rules, still invested in the outcome, but something shifted in you. Some part of your mind had stepped outside the game and was now watching from above. And that was the moment when everything started to feel subtly wrong. It's different from sadness. Sadness is an emotion. This is something stranger. This is a kind of distance from emotions themselves. You can still access the memory of how you used to feel things. You can still describe them. You can still identify them in other people. But when you try to generate those feelings in yourself now, there's a lag. There's a space between the stimulus and your response. You see something that's supposed to move you, and instead of moving, you notice that you're noticing. You hear news that should upset you, but instead you hear yourself cataloging the reasons you should be upset, while remaining strangely untouched by it. You're present in your life, but you're present in a different way now. You're present like a scientist in a lab, observing the experiment, rather than present like someone actually living inside the experiment. And what's most disorienting is that you can't quite locate the moment when the observer took over. You were inside it one day, and then you were outside it the next, and there's no clear dividing line, just a slow realization that you've become someone who watches rather than someone who participates. You might be calling this depression. You might be diagnosing yourself with a kind of emotional numbness or detachment. You might be convinced that something fundamental has broken inside you, that you've become cold or distant or somehow emotionally deficient in a way that everyone else isn't. You lie awake at night wondering if you're losing your capacity to feel, if you're becoming the kind of person who is incapable of genuine connection, who is stuck behind an invisible wall, forever observing, but never truly participating. There's a shame that comes with this too, because you know you should be able to care more, you know you should be moved by things. You look at people around you and they seem to have an access to life that you no longer have. They seem more real, more present, more alive than you are. And so you judge yourself. You become suspicious of your own coldness. You start to wonder if you're broken, or selfish, or fundamentally incapable of the kind of authentic feeling that real human beings have. The guilt deepens. Maybe you're becoming a sociopath. Maybe you're the kind of person who was never truly capable of feeling, and now that's finally becoming obvious. Maybe this has always been you, and you're only now seeing it clearly. But here's the thing that no one taught you. And this is where the confusion begins to dissolve. What you're experiencing is not a failure of your emotional system. It's not a sign that you're broken or cold or deficient. It's not a psychiatric category that needs to be medicated away or fixed through sheer force of willpower. What you're experiencing is the beginning of a fundamental shift in consciousness. You are beginning to wake up to something that you've never been taught to consciously see. Your entire life you've been operating from a series of assumptions about how you should think, feel, and be. These assumptions were handed to you so gradually and so completely that they became invisible. They felt like the natural way to be human. But they were never natural. They were conditioning. They were programming. And what's happening right now, this strange distancing, this emotional flatness, this creeping sense that something is off, this is your mind beginning to recognize the difference between the real and what you've been taught to see as real. Think about how you were taught to think. Not consciously, of course. It happened before you even had the capacity to know you were being taught. You learned, almost from birth, to break reality into categories, to name things, to organize the world into language. You learned to separate yourself from the world. You learned to see yourself as an individual observer, looking out at a separate reality. And then you learned what was important about that reality. You learned what was worth pursuing. You learned what made you worthy. You learned the metrics by which you would measure your own value as a human being. Success meant something specific. Beauty meant something specific. Intelligence meant something specific. Happiness meant something specific. Love meant something specific. These weren't neutral observations. These were cultural downloads, deeply embedded in every institution you passed through, school, family, media, social circles, and you learned them so thoroughly that they became indistinguishable from what you believed you were thinking on your own. You thought you were choosing your goals. You thought you were developing your own values. But you were mostly executing a script that had been written long before you were born, and you executed it with more or less success, depending on your temperament and your circumstances. Some versions of the script came naturally to you. Others you had to force. But the script itself, the fundamental way you were taught to see yourself, the world and the connection between them, that remained largely invisible. Now, what's happening inside you right now, in this moment of strange distance and flatness, is that some part of your mind is beginning to see the script, not as script anymore, but as script. There's a distinction there, and it matters profoundly. For the first time, you're becoming conscious of the process. You're noticing the gap between the automatic responses you've been trained to give and the actual reality unfolding in front of you. You're noticing the difference between what you've been taught to desire and what actually matters. You're noticing the difference between the performance you've been giving and your actual inner experience. And that gap, that newfound visibility, is both the cause of the flatness and the beginning of something real. Think of it like this. Imagine that your entire life you've been sitting in a theater, watching a movie projected on a screen. You didn't know you were in a theater. You thought the movie was reality. You were so absorbed in the story that you experienced it as completely real. Your emotions responded to it. Your identity developed in relation to it. You made decisions based on what was happening on that screen. But then, slowly, something begins to shift. Your eyes start to adjust. You begin to see the theater itself. You begin to notice the edges of the screen. You notice that the light is coming from behind you, from a projection booth you never knew existed. And suddenly, the movie is still playing, but you can see it for what it is now. It's still beautiful, perhaps. It's still engaging. But it's not real in the way you thought it was, and you can't unsee the theater. You can't go back to being completely absorbed in the movie, because you're too aware of the machinery now. This is the source of the flatness. The movie has lost some of its power, because you can see it's a movie, and nothing has been replaced yet. You're in that strange in-between space where the old way of being has become transparent enough to question, but the new way of being isn't yet solid enough to feel real. You're aware, but your awareness is still untethered. You're seeing through the old narratives, but you haven't yet constructed a new understanding of what's real that you can fully inhabit. So you're left in this peculiar suspended state. You're not in the movie anymore, but you're not yet fully in the theater either. You're aware enough to know that the automatic responses don't work anymore, but not experienced enough to know what actually does. And this is why everything feels hollow, not because you're broken, but because you're in the process of becoming conscious. The emotionality that has drained away, the ease with which you once felt engaged, moved, passionate about things, that wasn't your real emotional capacity. That was your emotional capacity channeled through a system of conditioning. You felt intensely about the things you'd been trained to care about. You felt motivated by the goals you'd been trained to pursue. You felt the satisfaction of achievement because you'd been trained to believe that achievement mattered. And as long as you didn't see the training, as long as the conditioning remained invisible, those emotions felt completely authentic. But once you start to see the conditioning, the emotions can't remain the same. They can't, because they were always dependent on a certain kind of blindness. You can't unsee. And so there's a period where the old emotional world has been revealed as somewhat constructed, and the new emotional world hasn't yet formed. You're emotionally empty not because you've become incapable of feeling, but because you're no longer willing to generate emotions based on values you no longer genuinely believe in. This is what nobody tells you about consciousness. They tell you it's enlightening. They tell you it's liberating. They tell you it's going to make you happier, more authentic, more alive. But what they don't tell you is that the path to consciousness runs through a valley of emptiness. It runs through a period where meaning collapses before it rebuilds. It runs through a time when you're going to feel fundamentally separated from the world around you, because you are, in fact, separated. You've crossed a threshold, and the world on the other side looks different now. The people who are still absorbed in the movie look strange to you, not in a superior way, but in a strange way. They're still operating from assumptions that you can now see clearly are assumptions. They're still pursuing goals, with an intensity of belief that you can no longer muster, because you've seen too much to believe in those goals the same way anymore. And this separation is lonely. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because you're in a transition space that most people don't consciously enter until they've been forced there by crisis. The anger or irritation you might feel toward people's blindness, don't trust that. The judgment you might feel about how unaware people are, about how trapped they are in their conditioning, don't trust that either. This is your ego, and it's clever. It's found a new operating system. It found a new story to tell about itself, and it's going to try to convince you that your newfound awareness makes you superior, that you're enlightened, that you're evolved beyond the mass of people who are still trapped. This is one of the most dangerous moments on this path, because it's so easy to mistake the ability to see the conditioning for an actual transcendence of the conditioning. You've simply become aware of it. You haven't transcended it. You're still operating within patterns. They're just different patterns now. You're still using the same mind that was trained to create hierarchies and to measure yourself against others. Except now you're creating a new hierarchy, one where the aware are superior to the unaware, where the conscious are better than the unconscious, and you can convince yourself that this is enlightenment. Be clear about what's happening here. The newfound awareness is real. The ability to see the conditioning is real, but the temptation to make this into a spiritual achievement, a badge of honor, a sign that you're more evolved, that's the conditioning wearing a new mask. That's the ego that has always operated by creating a sense of specialness, and it's found a new source of specialness. You're not better, you're just different. You're in a different phase of consciousness. You're experiencing a different set of illusions than you were before. The form has changed, but the underlying game is still playing. You're still caught in the process of narrative making, still caught in the process of trying to become something, still caught in the process of judging yourself and others. The content has changed. The structure remains, and if you're not careful, you'll spend years convinced that you've awakened, only to discover that you've simply exchanged one set of illusions for a more subtle set. You'll become hard in a new way, cold in a new way, disconnected in a new way. The emptiness you felt when the old narratives collapsed will turn into a kind of pride, a kind of stance, a kind of identity. And you'll be right back where you started, just with more sophisticated language to justify it. But this is not a reason to reject the awareness itself. This is not a reason to try to force yourself back into the comfort of unconditional belief. The awareness is real. The seeing is real. What's unreal is the story you're going to try to build on top of it, the identity you're going to try to construct out of it. The emptiness you're in right now is not a problem to be solved or a stage to be transcended. It's a kind of freedom. It's the space between scripts. It's the moment when the old way of being has been revealed, and the new way is not yet solidified. And in that space there's an opportunity to see, not with the eyes of the conditioned mind, but with the eyes of something more fundamental, not something more evolved, just something more real. The isolation you're feeling, the sense that you're separate from how everyone else seems to be engaging with life, allow that to be true for now. Don't rush to fix it or bridge it. Don't try to force yourself back into enthusiasm or false connection. The distance is honest. The distance is actually more authentic than the false enthusiasm you were generating before. You're not connecting with people from a place of genuine shared meaning right now because you're in the process of deconstructing what meaning is. You're not pursuing goals with intensity because you're questioning what goals are even worth pursuing. You're not feeling the pleasure of achievement because you're seeing, maybe for the first time, that the pleasure you thought you felt was always partially constructed by expectations and narratives. This is not pathological. This is lucid. This is what actual seeing looks like. It doesn't feel good. That's the whole point. If enlightenment felt the way achievement feels, then it would just be another way of running the same game with a new score system. What's happening in your nervous system right now is profound. You're experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance that goes deeper than normal confusion. You're holding two truths at the same time. You can see the conditioning, which means you're not fully trapped in it anymore, but you're also still operating within it, still using the mind that was conditioned, still embedded in a world that runs on conditioned patterns. This creates a strain. Your mind doesn't want to hold both of these things at once. It wants to choose one or the other. It wants to either fully believe in the old narratives again or fully transcend them. But that's not possible. The movement into consciousness is not a jump from one stable platform to another. It's a walking across a threshold where both doors are open, where you can see both sides, and where you have to find a way to exist in both at the same time. Your confusion is accurate. Your flatness is accurate. Your sense of alienation is accurate. These are not symptoms of pathology. They're signs that you're actually seeing what's there. The old way you felt pleasure, the excitement of planning, the satisfaction of achieving, the sense of specialness that came from being good at the things your culture valued, that pleasure was always parasitic on a kind of unconsciousness. It depended on you not seeing the full picture. It depended on you believing that the things you were pursuing actually mattered in the way your conditioning had taught you to believe they mattered. Once you can see that belief, you can't generate that pleasure the same way anymore. Not because you're incapable of pleasure, but because that particular flavor of pleasure required a particular kind of blindness, and you're not blind anymore, so something has to change. Either you force yourself back into blindness, and you'll know you're doing it, which means the blindness won't work the same way, or you move into a different relationship with pleasure, with meaning, with engagement. That different relationship is not more intense, it's not more satisfying in the way you understand satisfaction, but it's more real, it's more stable. It doesn't depend on constant external reinforcement. It doesn't depend on believing stories about yourself. It doesn't depend on winning. There's a passage through this. It doesn't look like what you think awakening is supposed to look like. There are no dramatic breakthroughs. There are no moments of sudden elation. There's just a gradual widening of your capacity to be present with what is, without needing it to be different, without needing it to conform to the stories you've been told about how life is supposed to feel. That capacity is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It grows so slowly that you don't notice it growing. You simply wake up one day and realize that you're no longer as desperate for things to feel different. You realize that you can sit in silence without trying to fill it. You realize that you can watch people pursuing the things they've been conditioned to pursue and feel a kind of compassion for that without the contamination of judgment. You realize that meaning is something that emerges from actual engagement with life, not something that's supposed to be handed to you by your culture or your psychology, and this realization doesn't feel like victory. It feels like relief, like finally putting down something you've been carrying for so long that you forgot you were carrying it. The journey from the place you're in right now, the hollow place, the empty place, the place where the old meaning has collapsed, but the new has not yet formed, that journey has no guaranteed end point. It doesn't lead to happiness. It doesn't lead to enlightenment. It doesn't lead to anything you can brand or market or reduce to a philosophy, but it leads to something real. It leads to the possibility of actually being here in your life, with your actual circumstances, without the constant noise of your conditioning telling you that things should be different. It leads to the possibility of genuine connection, because that connection isn't dependent on a mutually constructed fantasy about what connection is supposed to feel like. It leads to the possibility of actual meaning, because that meaning is rooted in what matters to you now that you've seen through the false meanings you were handed. It leads, most importantly, to the possibility of actual presence. Not presence as a meditation technique or a spiritual practice, but presence as a natural state when you're no longer locked in a desperate narrative about who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing. Right now, in this moment of flatness and distance, you are actually closer to presence than you've ever been. You're just in the part where it doesn't feel good yet. You're in the part where the old scaffolding has been revealed as insufficient, but the new way of standing hasn't yet solidified. This is the loneliest part. This is the part that no one wants to write books about because it's not inspiring or uplifting or motivational. This is the part where you're supposed to just stay present with the emptiness, just stay present with the alienation, just stay present with the sense that something is fundamentally wrong, even though nothing is wrong. Everything is exactly as it should be. You're waking up, and waking up hurts. Not because there's anything wrong with waking up, but because you've been sleeping for so long that the light looks like pain. What you're going through is not a clinical issue. It's not a spiritual emergency. It's not a sign that you need to be fixed. It's a sign that something in you is working exactly as it should be. Some part of your consciousness has recognized the gap between the real and the conditioned, and it's pulling you toward the real. That pull feels like emptiness, because the real hasn't yet formed itself into a new narrative structure that your mind can cling to. It's just the raw fact of reality without the stories, and your mind hates that. Your mind wants stories. Your mind wants meaning that it can understand and navigate and feel special within. But raw reality doesn't come packaged that way. Raw reality is quiet, it's neutral, it doesn't care what you think about it, and that's exactly what makes it real. It's not trying to convince you of anything. It's not trying to make you feel anything in particular. It's just what's here. And as you develop the capacity to tolerate that, to sit with that without your mind constantly trying to create meaning or value out of it, you develop something that they haven't taught you a name for. They don't teach you because it can't be marketed. It can't be achieved, it can't be displayed or proven or measured. It can only be lived. And it involves a fundamental shift in where you're looking for reality. You stop looking for it in stories. You stop looking for it in achievements. You stop looking for it in other people. You start looking for it in the direct, unmediated experience of being alive right now. And that experience is nothing like what you've been told it should be. It's much quieter. It's much less special. And it's the only thing that's actually true. So don't rush this passage. Don't try to get back to the good feelings. Don't try to restore meaning before you've fully deconstructed what false meaning was. Don't try to bridge the distance before you've really felt how real that distance is. Let the emptiness do its work. Let the alienation teach you something. Let the flatness show you what was propping everything up. You're not broken, you're not lost, you're not failing. You're in the only passageway that actually leads somewhere real. And yes, it feels like the opposite of all those things. Yes, it feels like death, but that's because something is dying, not you, not your capacity for feeling or living or being human. What's dying is the false self you were trained to be, and that death has to feel real because it is real. Something that was never actually you is finally being seen through, finally being released, and the emptiness you feel is what's left when you stop pretending. The emptiness is not a problem. The emptiness is the beginning of everything real.